All right. Welcome everyone to our webinar, our J Street webinar today on U.S. policy after the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the recent violence in Israel and Palestine. I'm just going to talk for another few seconds here as I can see that participants, audience members are still coming in, which is great. Looks like we have a good number of people joining us. And in just a few more seconds, I will start introducing the webinar. I think we should be good to go for that now. Okay, great. My name is Deborah Shushan. I am the Director of Government Affairs at J Street, and I am pleased to welcome you today to our webinar entitled After the Ceasefire, Resetting U.S. Policy in the Middle East. This is a pretty significant time in terms of developments in Israel and the Palestinian territory. As you all know, of course, there was a recent round of hostilities in which about 12 people were killed in Israel, over 200 in Gaza, in fighting between Israel and the Palestinians. And of course, all of that was kicked off by the developments in Jerusalem, both in Sheikh Jarrah, with the looming evictions of Palestinians there, and also fighting on the Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif as well. And so we're going to talk today about developments and potential in U.S. policy going forward, possibility for resetting U.S. policy. We'll also talk a little bit about the latest developments in Israel in terms of government formation there. There is the potential for a change government in Israel, which would be a really significant development in terms of Israeli politics. So we'll bring that in as well. And now I'm going to introduce, we have two great speakers for you today. And first, I'll begin by introducing Congressman Jerry Connolly. He is the representative from the best congressional district in the country. That is my own congressional district, which is Virginia 11. And I'm very lucky to have the congressman as my representative in the US Congress. I really couldn't ask for better. To say a few more words about Congressman Connolly, he serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which of course is very significant for us at J Street. And he also serves on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform. He is very much an expert on foreign policy, in addition to being on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, you were a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for years.
I was, and I was hired by a young senator from Delaware, Joseph R. Biden Jr.
Amazing, amazing. I didn't know that last detail. So obviously, Congressman Connolly has much more expertise on foreign policy than is the case for the average member of Congress. And we are really excited to have him here today. I'm also going to introduce our second speaker, and that is Dr. Shibli Telhami. He is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. He is also a non-resident senior fellow with the Center for Middle East Policy in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. In the past, he served as senior advisor to the U.S. Department of State, an advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN, an advisor to Congressman Lee Hamilton, and also as a member of the Iraq Study Group. He is a very eminent professor of international relations of the Middle East, and we're really excited to have him as well. And we'll be turning to him in just a little bit. But first, we're going to start with Congressman Connolly. And Congressman, I'd like to first talk a little bit about the recent spasm of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Congress's response to it. You chose to co-lead a letter to President Biden, and this is a letter that J Street strongly supported, which called for bold action by the Biden administration to help bring about an immediate ceasefire. My question for you is whether you were surprised at the success of this letter, which got a total of 138 members signing on in less than 24 hours. And what do you think that tells us about the appetite in Congress for a bolder U.S. foreign policy on Israel and Palestine?
Well, certainly, Deborah, and thank you for having me on. Certainly, I think views have shifted. And J Street can take some credit for this because I think J Street has created a lot of political space in which pro-Israeli members of Congress, and I'm one of them, nonetheless reserve the right to be critical of policies we believe are inimical both to the long-term stability of Israel and to the Middle East peace process itself. And I think you saw that in how quickly, in 24 hours, we got 138 signatures on that letter. Press attention was sort of focused on the debate that had occurred earlier in that week, where there was a far left critique of Israel, and there was a strong, pro-Israeli debate, and somehow that characterized the split in the Democratic Caucus. That's not true. The Democratic Caucus is largely where we are. We favor a two-state solution, but we also want rights for the Palestinian people. And we want to see, we wanted to see a very quick end and a ceasefire to what was happening in Gaza and in Israel itself. And we're also very concerned about sort of faux equivalence. It is true that Hamas, as a terrorist organization, was raining rockets down on Israel proper, and that cost 11 Israeli lives and damaged property, and was a terrible thing to have to live with. Iron Dome technology we helped provide worked by and large, but if you look at the devastation in Gaza, it was immense. 1,000 residential units destroyed, 17 hospitals and clinics badly damaged, 230 people, mostly civilians, killed, 67 of whom were children. And now a monumental task in trying to rebuild. And when homes are destroyed, that lasts generations. That memory doesn't just go away with a new residence. People talk about that for generations. And so it adds to the enmity, it adds to the implacable sort of hostility that builds up. And that's why we thought, we needed a ceasefire immediately. And initially, the Biden administration, I think, was slow to react to what was happening, and maybe to buy the Israeli government some time, I don't know. But we felt differently. We felt that no, a ceasefire needed to be, achieved and abided by immediately to end the violence and try to start to pick up the pieces and see if there aren't some opportunities in this travail.
Right, and we were so happy, Congressman, to work with you on that, and really greatly appreciate your leadership. So as I mentioned in introducing you that you are a senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You are, of course, a respected leader on foreign policy in Congress. And of course, J Street is very proud to work closely with you. With a new president now, and after this latest round of deadly violence between Israel and Hamas, we at J Street think that there is a real opportunity to reset U.S. foreign policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which we think is especially crucial after the disastrous Trump years. So I'd love to ask you, what would you like to see in terms of American leadership on this issue? And how do you think that Congress can play a constructive role?
So I think I want to give the Biden administration some credit here. Tony Blinken, our new Secretary of State, has moved relatively swiftly to repair some of the damage and undo some of the bad decisions made in the Trump years. He, announced the reopening of the consulate in East Jerusalem. He announced the resumption of aid to the Palestinian Authority and a program to help reconstruct in the Gaza. He clearly is going to oppose the extension of new settlements in the West Bank, and he has reaffirmed U.S. support for a two-state solution. And I think those are really important first steps. What happened during the Trump years was literally, a U.S. complicity and partnership in Netanyahu's policies, which were to make a two-state solution impossible on the ground, and to take pieces off the chessboard in terms of a peace process. Whether we should move the embassy to Jerusalem or not should be a decision in the context of peace negotiations. It shouldn't be done unilaterally. Annexation of the Golan Heights should not be done unilaterally. Declaring settlements not illegal, even though under international law they most certainly are. And historically, every president, Republican or Democrat, has declared them as such, except for Trump and his ambassador, Mr. Friedman. And so real damage was done in terms of our credibility as an arbiter, as a convener. And I think the Biden administration deserves credit for trying to move swiftly to repair that damage. But it's going to take a lot of hands-on work. And I know the administration, in a pandemic and with respect to damage to allies, has a lot on its plate. But the Middle East forces itself onto that plate, whether we like it or not. And I do think that there's still much more to be done. Resuming financial assistance from the United States to the Palestinian Authority, I think, is in our interest and Israel's interest. Otherwise, it just strengthens the hand of Hamas, which presumably we don't want to do.
That's a really important point, and something that we've been emphasizing as well, that if you don't want to see Hamas strengthen, then it's important to strengthen the moderates. So I think that's a really good point, Congressman. We have to let you go in just a couple of minutes, unfortunately, and we know how valuable your time is, and really appreciate you spending some of it with us. But before I do let you go, I'd love for you to address the very latest news out of Israel. It does look like there is a good chance that we may actually have a change government forming in Israel that would finally, perhaps, it sounds crazy to say it, but bring an end to the reign of Bibi Netanyahu. It would be a very unusual coalition that would have as its prime minister Naftali Bennett, who's very much a right-winger, but it would also have significant presence from the center and from the left as well. And so would love to hear your thoughts, Congressman, on what your thoughts on a potential change government that finally won't include Netanyahu for the first time in so many years, and what that can and should mean for U.S. foreign policy going forward.
Let me say, Deborah, first, I welcome a new government in Israel. I believe Netanyahu has been himself an existential threat to the future of Israel. His opposition, his implacable opposition to the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, all it did was to produce non-compliance finally by Iran, which had been in full compliance before, and persuading Trump to vitiate the agreement. And what happened? Well, Iran resumed nuclear development. We don't want a nuclear Iran. And the best way to achieve a non-nuclear Iran is that Iran nuclear agreement. Netanyahu, you may remember, stunned the political establishment here in Washington by dissing then President Barack Obama, the head of state of the United States government, and accepted an invitation without any consultation with the White House to speak to a joint session of Congress. And he announced when he spoke on the floor of the House that what he was doing this, it was above politics because the stakes were just so high, and that this agreement was, he felt, Obama's agreement, an existential threat to Israel. Now, what did he do after that? He went back and campaigned for another election within that week and used footage of that speech in a political campaign ad. Now, it's illegal for me to do that. And he told us this was about politics. It wasn't about politics until, of course, a week later. Netanyahu is an ethically challenged political figure. He's lurched Israel politics to the right, including even the authoritarian right. He actually engaged with the Kahani party to bring them into a new Netanyahu-led government, a political group whose antecedents certainly were declared terrorists, not only by our government, but by the Israeli government. This is a very troubling development in Israeli politics, and Netanyahu was its architect. And I also believe what he did with Obama and what he's done in aligning himself with Donald Trump was to drive a huge partisan political wedge here in America for the first time in terms of basic support for the state of Israel. And I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. And you see that reflected in polling in younger generations of Americans in terms of their views about Israel. And Netanyahu can take credit for that, if I can put it that way. So I think it is essential that there be a new government and it not be one that includes Bibi Netanyahu. We need to approach the prospective new government very clear-eyed. As you mentioned, Naftali Bennett is a very far-right figure who does not support the two-state solution, who favors annexation, who favors expansion of settlements. Now, his Yamina party only has, I think, 7 seats, and your Lapid, of course, has 17. So this is going to be an uneasy, if not unstable, coalition. But I think this coalition is what's going to be required if we don't go to either new elections or have another Netanyahu-led caretaker government. And I think that's essential for the peace process. I think it's essential for U.S. re-engagement. I think it's essential to try to rebuild public support for that peace process for Israel, for a two-state solution here in the United States.
Congressman, that was so eloquently put. And I think you just made everyone who is watching this call, who doesn't, like myself, live in the 11th District of Virginia, feel very jealous that they don't have you as their representative. If only we had more people with your depth of knowledge and your approach to this issue in Congress, we would be in phenomenal shape.
You're very kind. You're very kind. And thank you, Deborah.
It's all absolutely genuine, Congressman. And we're so happy to have you join us today. Thank you so much. And we are excited to keep working with you. Thank you. All right. So as the Congressman signs off here, and we've been really delighted to have him, I am now very pleased to welcome our next speaker, and that is Dr. Shibli Telhami. And we are really pleased to have him. And we've got a lot of great questions for you, Dr. Telhami. We'll turn to those in just a second. But before I do, let me just echo what my colleague Nate put into the chat a little bit ago, which is that if you do have a question for the Q&A that we'll have with Dr. Telhami after I pose some initial questions to him, you can go right ahead and do as some have already done and put your question into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions, so I will try to get to as many as we can. But first, I'd like to kick it off. And I think, Dr. Telhami, we might just want to pick up where Congressman Connolly just left off with this very latest moment in Israeli politics. And I know you've been following very closely what's going on. I'd love to just get your take on the possibility of this change government and what it might mean for U.S. policy.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And it was lovely to hear the congressman before, very eloquent, as you put it, making very clear and important points. Obviously, if this government does come into fruition, which looks likely at this point, it will be certainly the end of the Netanyahu era, for sure. I wouldn't call it a new era of Israeli politics, but the end of the Netanyahu era. That's important because, as the congressman said, Netanyahu himself has not only been, quote, ethically challenged, but clearly has been at odds with the kind of objectives of the U.S. government on Iran, on Israel-Palestine, and has allied himself with clearly racist, profoundly racist, even militant racist groups in ways that has generated even more friction and conflict within Israel itself among Palestinian Israeli citizens and Jewish Israeli citizens that we've seen in the recent crisis. So his departure would be welcome, certainly for the United States, but I think for everyone involved. Um, I do think, though, that we need to sit back a little bit because I don't think we should expect all that much from this government. They will obviously, it's a contradictory government because what brings them together is opposition to Netanyahu. And let's be frank. The Israeli right has a solid majority in Israel right now. One of the big reasons why they're not united and sort of disregard the left and the center is Netanyahu, because he is the divider among them. And without him, it's not improbable to see whether this government survives for a few months or a year and a half, that the Israeli right could still put a coalition together, marginalizing Arab citizens further and marginalizing the central left further, because that's really the reality in Israel, is that you have a solid right-wing majority right now. Maybe it's fluid, you could say, and certainly that's true in general, but that's the reality right now. A second thing is, it's not transformative for Palestinian Israelis. And I say that because, 73 years after the establishment of the state of Israel, it's still not acceptable for a government, even a government that's seen to be a coalition government with people from the left, to have members of Arab parties as part of the coalition. The only way you can have them is really, quote, to have them support from the outside, vote for the government to maintain a 61 majority, but without involving them directly in the governance. And that's certainly the kind of formula that Yitzhak Rabin, the late Yitzhak Rabin, relied on as well. But nothing has changed in that regard. Even as Palestinian Israelis, before this recent crisis, have been showing that they want to get involved in Israeli politics. Even as you could see, the Islamic Party wanted to get involved in politics. And certainly before that, the Joint List, one of the reasons why the Joint List got a lot in the previous election when they all unified was, in fact, that the Arab citizens wanted them to be more involved in Israeli politics. But now something else happened. I mean, you still want, people want to get involved, but what happened inside Israel between Arabs and Jews is profoundly problematic in a way that is going to be challenging for any government to deal with.
I think that's absolutely right. Certainly, the intercommunal violence that we've seen in the past weeks, and especially perpetrated against Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, is a very, very disturbing development. I want to turn a little bit now to U.S. foreign policy, and I'd love to, for you as an expert who tracks U.S. policy on the conflict very closely, to give us your assessment of the Biden administration's approach, both before, during, and also since the recent spasm of violence. And I'm really interested, Dr. Telhami, in whether you were surprised to see the degree and kind of active engagement by members of Congress that we witnessed during this recent crisis.
Yeah, let me start with the latter one, actually. No, I was not surprised. And as you know very well, I've been tracking this for years. I've been arguing that there's been a profound transformation in the Democratic Party. I think, one of the few people to identify that 10 years ago. I've been tracking this and writing about it, that there has been a profound transformation within the Democratic Party, that is partly demographic because of the changing base of the Democratic Party, but because also of the tenure of Benjamin Netanyahu, over a 12-year period that spanned both the Obama presidency, two administrations, and the Trump administration, and because of kind of the rise in the focus on social justice issues that put a different perspective on the question of Palestine in a way that created a lot more prioritizing within the Democratic constituency on this issue. Now, I had always wondered when it would take for leadership in Congress to catch up to public opinion, because we had tracked that public was, by the way, majority of Democrats for years have been prepared to impose sanctions over settlements, the settlements issue in Israel, according to the polls that we've had. And even 7 years ago, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying it's really a matter of time what this gap cannot be sustained. And we've seen that, since the last, particularly Democratic primaries, less so the general elections, how these played themselves out. So no, I was not surprised. However, I think Biden was surprised. And as I have said in the article I did for the Boston Globe, I think he's a throwback to another era of Democratic politics. And I don't think he was in tune with what's happened on this issue. I mean, a throwback on this issue, because frankly, I was very impressed with how Biden has been handling, issues like social justice and racial justice and the economy, and how he caught on with the changes that have taken place with the party. We all have been very pleased to see what happened. But on this issue, he clearly hasn't caught on. He's part of a different kind of a cultural era on this issue. And in that sense, he failed in handling this crisis. He bungled it, in my opinion. And I said so, even as someone who has supported and still support his administration. And I say that not because what happened before the crisis. You said, how did they do before the crisis? Frankly, I don't blame him before the crisis. I mean, the reality of it is this was not a priority issue. And no one really expected it to be, including those who care about the issue. I mean, as everyone points out, because you got the pandemic, the economy, and even on the Middle East, you got the Iran nuclear issue, which was a priority and should be a priority issue, because frankly, when you think about it, it's probably the only issue that could potentially draw the U.S. into war it does not want. And that for that reason, it was extremely important for him to prioritize that. And I think partly because of that, he didn't want to open another front with the government of Bibi Netanyahu, because he knew that the opposition is strong to the JCPOA, and he was handling it. He wanted to land that. And he was very careful on what he said and what he did on the Palestinian issue. So up until that point, where their focus was not on conflict ending, not on political process, but more on humanitarian, reversing some of what Trump had done, all the damaging steps, renewing aid, planning for the reopening of the consulate in Jerusalem. All these things were important. But once the crisis erupted, and the scale of the crisis and the issues that were at stake required a different kind of approach, at least statement, not in the sense that suddenly this issue is going to become a top priority for the president. No, I know that it wasn't. It's not likely. I don't think anybody would expect it. But here is, even before the rockets fell from Gaza, and then the Israeli massive bombings that killed so many people in Gaza, the issue, remember, wasn't Gaza and wasn't Hamas. The issue that galvanized Palestinians, galvanized the Arab world, was Jerusalem, for God's sake. I mean, people keep, you can use the Hamas boogeyman as much as you want, but that's not what started it. What started was a plan to expel Palestinians from their home in Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem, and then the assault on Al-Aqsa Mosque that was provocative in a way that galvanized not only Palestinians, but a lot of people outside. And the fact that Biden failed to condemn that, to say this is wrong, particularly the expulsions, is problematic in my eyes. This is something, the administration, oh, we're doing this and this behind the scene. I'm sorry, this is not a question about what you do behind the scene. It is a question about what you stand for. And even if you fail, even if you don't get the Israelis to stop, it's very important to put yourself on the record. This is something about what we stand for. When you are saying you're going to lead on human rights and international law and democracy, and you don't stand up when you see that not only is it blatant violation, but also one that has generated so much violence and conflict and could expand beyond, something really doesn't quite work here. And I think they failed. Since the end of that, obviously, they've tried to do better. And I think they've done better. Certainly, whether or not they're the ones who are responsible for the ceasefire, it's a question mark. I happen to think that the Israelis had exhausted their targets. I think it's a question that was more hurtful to them to go on than helpful. I happen to think certainly Hamas wanted it to end, and the Egyptians played a role. That remains to be seen how much of a role the administration played. They've done well by going out there, and Secretary Blinken going out there and dealing with people trying to solidify it. But again, I have not heard to this day a principled stand on what was wrong in the process of that crisis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Telhami. And I do really appreciate you underscoring how this conflict started, that it had its origins in Sheikh Jarrah and the evictions, which of course have been an ongoing process over many years. So that is really important. And it's something that, we at J Street have been emphasizing to members of Congress and their staff to keep their focus on, and not just obviously the Israel-Hamas piece. So I appreciate you underscoring it here. There are two things that I want to pick up on from the comments that you made just now. And the first one of those continues on the theme of public opinion. You spoke about public opinion and the evolution of it over a period of years within the Democratic Party. But you've also written about something else in terms of public opinion that I think our listeners would find very interesting. And that is that you have been tracking for some time opinion on this conflict by evangelical Christians, who are, of course, another very important constituency when it comes to this issue. And I wonder if you might share with us a little bit. This is something that you've written about very recently as well. How public opinion among evangelical Christians have shifted in recent years, and what you think that might mean going forward among this key population.
Thanks so much, Deborah, for that question, in part because I think you're right. This is really important. I mean, we're focused on the Democratic Party dynamics, but there's something bigger going on in America. And we've seen it across the board outside the Democratic Party. But to the extent that there was one constituency that was committed to a right-wing Israel, I don't say to Israel, to a right-wing Israel, meaning an agenda, an expansion agenda, control the West Bank, perhaps based on a biblical narrative of what Israel, what belongs to Israel, it is the evangelicals. We've seen that in public opinion polls. The less the Democratic Party supported Israel, the more the Republican Party supported Israel, almost exclusively because of the evangelicals. And I've showed that in prior polling how central that is. So what is happened, and the research I'm doing on this is part of a book I'm writing on evangelicals, politics in Israel that I've been working on for 5 years now, and doing a lot of polling, but as well as interviews and as well as archival work. So this is an ongoing project. But the fascinating part is that over the past couple of years, we have seen a shift among young evangelicals, and it's not a small shift. It's not generational shift that typically happens among every group. There is a generational shift in America anyway. Younger people tend to be more critical of Israel, whether they're Republican, Democrats, or independents. That's typically true. But the gap between young evangelicals and older evangelicals is so big and widening that it simply cannot be explained by the generational divide. And what got me to think about it more and do more analysis over the past 2 weeks is that there was this obviously statement you all heard from former Israeli ambassador to Washington, Ron Dermer, who said, let's rely on the evangelicals, forget American Jews, more or less. I'm paraphrasing. And that generated a lot of reaction. But then 2 scholars from the University of North Carolina released a new poll in 2021 showing a huge drop, like more than half, more than 50% drop of support for Israel among younger evangelicals since 2018. So what we did in our analysis is show exactly from the polling that we have done among evangelicals, we showed a comparable drop that has taken place. Not only a comparable drop, but that much of the drop that took place in the support for Israel among young evangelical has translated directly into support for the Palestinians, to the point where the last poll we've done on evangelicals, it was basically even support for Palestinian and support for Israel among young evangelicals. And remember, like a majority of evangelical want to support Israel outright in this dynamic. So something really is going on. The question is, what explains it? I mean, that's really the question. If it's not generational, let me just give you very briefly three thoughts. One thought is that the Trump factor exacerbated the generational divide. Why? Because we know that young evangelicals have been more troubled by the alliance between Trump and their leaders and have protested that. And we know that had translated a little bit into being angry with Israel as a friend of Trump, mostly because we've seen that, according to my polls, while evangelicals support Israel, they thought that Trump supported Israel more than they did. This is kind of interesting. Keep that in mind, that they thought Trump was more pro-Israel than they were, even the evangelicals. So that's one thing. Second, I think there's the social justice element that we've seen play itself out in the conversation. That is, with progressive evangelicals working, reaching out to younger evangelicals, particularly, the prism through which they increasingly saw or they interpreted their faith is more one of social justice, more like traditional Christianity. And we've seen that on a host of issues, not just on Israel-Palestine, but on things like racial justice in America, the climate change, things of that sort. And that clearly was effective. But finally, the demographics are changing, so that the percentage of whites among younger evangelicals, the under 35, is much lower than it is among the older generation. And white evangelicals tend to be the most supportive of Israel. So something is going on that is really quite remarkable and I would even call it dramatic.
It is. I mean, it's fascinating, and I know from talking to J Street's leaders and supporters, this is something that is very fascinating to all of us. Obviously, we're predominantly a Jewish American organization, but we also recognize the tremendous importance that evangelical Christians have had in driving certainly Republican policy on Israel. And so, when you do finish your forthcoming book, Dr. Telhami, I am sure that we will ask you to come back and do a program entirely focused on that. So thank you for sharing your research with us. It's really fascinating. Let me just remind folks, I'm going to ask Dr. Telhami, I think, just one more question, and then I want to open it up for some Q&A. So if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Telhami, I know that you also follow politics in the Arab world more broadly, very closely, including how that intersects with Israel-Palestine. And I'm wondering if we could just talk for a moment about the recent normalization agreements between Israel and some Arab states. And I'd love to get your thoughts as to whether and what extent those agreements were tested over the past few weeks as Israel was conducting days of major airstrikes that killed over 200 Palestinians. Are you aware of any evidence that the states that normalized relations, like the UAE, for example, were able to use their increased influence, or whether they tried, with Israel to impact Israeli policy?
Absolutely none. I mean, I don't really see any evidence of the latter at all. But let me just give you a couple of reflections. First of all, obviously these deals were not about Israel-Palestine. I mean, let's be realistic, including the UAE deal, which I think the extent to which they stop annexation is, to me, is very much in doubt. I think that Netanyahu was with the unanimous opposition by Democrats to annexation that he faced. and the probable ascent of Democratic president clearly made it impossible for him. And there were also division within his own coalition on this. Gantz was obviously opposed to it as well. I think that was a fig leaf rather than a real explanation. But with all these agreements that we're talking about, including Bahrain, the UAE, the Sudan, Morocco, really we're only talking about one profoundly central one, which is the UAE. Why do I say that? Because the other ones were completely transactional, and brought about by the Trump administration using all its muscle and rewards and incentives and American money in some cases to persuade people to make a deal with Israel. And it didn't really matter much for the conduct of relations at some profound level, or didn't create a profound transformation. Like the relationship with Morocco really hasn't changed much, but they got recognition for the Western Sahara, which is quite a remarkable thing. So Bahrain isn't quite as central a country in politics as is the UAE. And frankly, it was a kind of the Saudis essentially given it a green light because they weren't going to do it. And Bahrain obviously is highly dependent on Saudi Arabia. So it's really kind of a corollary to what the Saudis couldn't do. Is basically Bahrain is the consolation prize for Israel. But the UAE is the one that was really kind of a strategic decision, and they're sticking with it. They're sticking with it, even though they are coming under a lot more criticism across the board after this event, and to the extent that people may have thought, well, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is no longer important in the Arab world. Suddenly, obviously, you have public opinion revived, and everybody's feeling a pressure, and there it goes. It's suddenly important again. But the UAE, I think it had made it. They have the resources. They were small enough where they can control their public opinion, and there's no evidence that they are changing their strategic path, but they're not able in any shape or form to use their relationship with Israel to impact Israel on something like this. And that's been obvious.
Thank you for that. So we are going to turn to questions from our audience now, and we've got lots that have been submitted. Thanks to everybody. So I'm going to package together, Dr. Telhami, a few questions that are focused on the Palestinian leadership and especially on Hamas. They are questions from Cindy Shulak-Rome, Louis Silber, and Renata Selig. I'm going to kind of put them together. So one of the questions is there any hope for a new Palestinian leadership? Another question is, given Hamas's dedication to destruction of Israel, can there be a two-state solution? And then a question about reconstruction in Gaza, excuse me. And the question there is, even if we pour a lot of money into humanitarian aid for civilians, into rebuilding Hamas, how can we move beyond this intractable situation with Hamas in control in Gaza?
Yeah. Well, first, let me talk about the leadership. Certainly, Palestinians want new leadership, and the Palestinians are not happy with the leadership in Ramallah or the leadership in Gaza. Although Hamas has done better, actually, in some ways, maintaining certain level of support than the Palestinian Authority at the public opinion level, as we've seen in the polling that was done in the lead up to the canceled elections in May. But I think there's clearly hunger for new generational leaders among Palestinians. And that's why I think a lot of Palestinians were looking forward to the May election, not because they thought that was going to be transformative, but they wanted to create a dynamism, at least in the leadership. And you've had over 90% Palestinians registered. You had over 30 slates register to run. Fatah splintered as a consequence of that. And so there was a lot of frustration when the elections were canceled, with the blessing, I should say, of the Biden administration, which was a kind of a surprise, because Mahmoud Abbas announced the election because he thought Biden may want them. He announced them in January as a new Democratic administration came. And the administration was only lukewarm on this issue and clearly of two minds with divisions within. But let me just say one thing about this leadership thing. And I know this is kind of propels a lot of people. Let us get real. The reason we don't have Israel-Palestine is not because we don't have Israeli-Palestinian peace, is not because the Palestinians don't have good leadership. Even if you had the most brilliant Palestinian leadership, I don't think we would be right now on the verge of peace. There is an incredible asymmetry of power enabled by us in the United States with domination, Israeli domination, military, political, economic, Palestinians under occupation. And you have a right-wing government in Israel that it just does not intend, I mean, let's be realistic, does not intend to create a viable Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And for that reason, I think that's really the most important thing. We got to be mindful of that, because don't get distracted by this argument. Oh, if there were only better Palestinians, I'm sorry, that's not the problem. Let's get real and let's keep focus on the problem. That's not part of that. Sure, I think I'd love to see better leaders for Palestinians, but that's not the critical issue for Israel-Palestine. Now, on Hamas, in the same vein, I think Hamas was created in 1988. It didn't exist at that time. Think about just the debate in Israel just recently, during the conflict and after the ceasefire, how a lot of opponents of Benjamin Netanyahu were saying, "You're the one who's keeping Hamas there, because without Hamas, you have a problem trying to justify why you're not making a deal with the Palestinians. You want Hamas as an excuse not to make a deal with the Palestinians, and then you're giving them enough to survive, but not enough to benefit the people." You've had people in the mainstream of Israel and Haaretz writing about how Israeli policy is not to bring Hamas to bring the Gaza and the West Bank together. So the Hamas issue is not entirely about what Hamas itself is doing or not is doing. And in 1988, when Hamas was created, happened right after the first Intifada emerged in 87, 20 years after the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. There was no progress whatsoever. Palestinians were quiet. They were not really creating any major, certainly not militant opposition. It was quiet political opposition and no end in sight, which is one reason why they erupted in 1987. So Israel didn't make peace with them at that time before Hamas was created. Hamas didn't come to control Gaza until after the 2006 election. And there was Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas. He was actually Israel's and America's candidate to replace Yasser Arafat. He wasn't given major concessions to be able to sell to his people. So Hamas is a problem, of course, for the Palestinians more than it is actually in general, because obviously, it's the kind of state that it would want for the Palestinians, not what most Palestinians I think would want. But again, I don't think that is the critical obstacle to Israeli-Palestinian peace. It is an obstacle, but it's not the central obstacle to Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Thank you for that. So our next question goes back to politics in Israel. And it's from Wally Yazbek, who points out that Haaretz is reporting today that Mansour Abbas, who is the head of the Islamist Ram party, may actually, he is saying that his party may actually be a part of the new coalition and not just supporting it from outside, which would be a huge development, a really fascinating, I think, development. I'm interested in your thoughts about whether you could actually envision this happening and Ram actually being part of a coalition government with a Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, from the Yamina party. And if that somehow does shake out, what would that mean for Israeli politics?
Well, if it does happen, if in fact it does take place, that would be a really significant shift, because just we haven't seen that. I mean, we've seen, a Druze member who was member of Likud become a minister of government in the past, and this government, there's a member of Meretz, who's a Muslim Arab, actually, whose grandfather was killed in the Kufr Qasim massacre in 1956, who was poised to become a minister. But he's, of course, in one of the mainstream Jewish parties. And this would be really revolutionary in some ways. That could mean a lot. And the oddity of all this is that, particularly coming from an Islamist party, which of course is coming out of the same Muslim Brotherhood as Hamas did, one that had been most under attack by the Israeli mainstream, because obviously most Palestinian Israelis is secular. And the Joint List was mostly made up of secular groups, not the Islamist coalition. And they've been conciliatory in favor of Arab-Jewish coexistence, like Ayman Odeh, the head of the Joint List, and Ahmad Tibi too. I mean, in different ways, they both pushed for the same thing. Here you have the one that was most unaccepted by the Israeli mainstream, and who normalized it is Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is the fascinating story, because the opportunism of Netanyahu, he would do anything that he can to stay in power, was the reason why he somehow revolutionized the relationship between Arab parties and the Jewish, even the Jewish right. It made it acceptable, because he lured them before the elections in a way in order to divide the Joint List. He succeeded. And initially, he said he would talk to them about supporting his coalition. Obviously, it didn't work out. But this is remarkable. And so in some ways, there's a little space that opened up because of Netanyahu. Whether or not that's doable, it's not just for Bennett, to be honest. Bennett is one who might have a problem. I think probably Lieberman as well would have a problem with that. It's not just Bennett, but also it's a problem for Mansour, because let's assume there is another explosion in Gaza tomorrow, and he just wouldn't be able to stay in the government. The next morning he'll have to resign, and so it'll be very volatile. So I think that's a problem for them, but it still would be revolutionary if it takes place.
Great. Thank you for that. We are nearing the end of our hour. And we do have a number of questions left. I fear we won't get to them all. What I'd like to do is package a couple of questions together right now for you, Shibli. One has to do with the Republican Party, and one has to do with the Biden administration. So we'll have one of each. The question about the Republican Party comes from Gene Berger. And his question goes back to the evangelical generational shift that you talked about. And his question is, given that, do you see eventually a path back to Republican support for a serious peace process effort and for two states, as we have seen from the Republican Party in the past, of course? And the question from Eli Schern has to do with whether the Biden administration and the president himself have reacted to the pressure from the left and the center left on Israel-Palestine. Eli notes, it seems in some ways he welcomes this pressure as a sort of counter in order to position himself as a moderate. And so do you think it is actually impacting the Biden administration?
Let me start with that easier one, the second one, which I think, yes, it is, of course. And I don't think it's for the reason of the pressure comes from the left. To be honest, I think that Biden really didn't understand what's happening in the Democratic Party on Israel-Palestine. He hadn't been paying attention to it. I've had a conversation with him when he was vice president of the White House, and he was in a different place on this issue. I think the question here is, to the extent that he doesn't want to open a front with Netanyahu, what does that mean? That means he expected the minute he opens a front for Netanyahu, members of Congress are going to start calling him. Why are you doing this? He's going to get pressure from the right on this, from pro-Netanyahu sectors in Congress. And so that's not what happened, of course, because that's not what you've heard Congressman Connell, these eloquent words. He's obviously, not representative of all of them, but there's a very large percentage of people who agree with him on this. And I think Biden was genuinely surprised by it. I don't think he expected it. And I think the fact that you had 11 Jewish members say that, the fact that you have, the chair of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, Menendez, take that, I think they were taken by surprise. And yes, it impacted them. They still don't want to deal with it, for understandable reason, but I think it impacted it. With the Republican Party, I have to say, yes, I could see change. I happen to think, first of all, that contrary to conventional wisdom, the drivers of Trump policy toward Israel were not the evangelicals. They were the foot soldiers who could persuade Trump that it's politically convenient, or his aides could persuade them that it's convenient. I think the drivers were very obvious. They were his son-in-law, Kushner, advisor, who cared a lot about this issue, his ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, they cared about this issue. He gave them pretty much full authority. And I think the fact that they can mobilize existing support from the evangelical community to make it politically acceptable for Trump to go along, I think they're the ones who drove policy. There was no pressure from the evangelicals on specific issues. They care a lot about Israel, but they don't have specific agenda per se, except some of their leaders. And on Jerusalem, for example, on moving the embassy to Jerusalem, we did a poll before the moving the embassy. They were divided, the evangelicals. They were not, Trump had given them everything they wanted on the issues they cared about, like religious schools and the Supreme Court and all of the things that they cared about most deeply and wanted from him to deliver their support. That was Israel wasn't one of the demands that Jerry Falwell made with him, Jerry Falwell Jr. made with him. And so I happen to think that we really need to also kind of become a little bit more analytical about what drove Trump. The evangelicals enabled it, but they were not the ones who drove it. And I think in the future, that's likely to be the case. That is, they will enable it. But if had Trump told them he wanted to recognize a full Palestinian state and, in the West Bank and Gaza, I doubt very much that they would have opposed it. You might have some who would have opposed it, but they would not have stopped him from doing it. Is this shift among the young indicative of some big shift coming down the road? It remains to be seen. I don't want to, we know that things shift, but it is remarkable. And it does suggest that something is up and that change is certainly possible.
Thank you so much for that. Well, with that, we have gotten basically to the end of our hour. I want to thank you profoundly, Dr. Telhami. We've had you on at J Street many times, and I think you've just showed us again why we continue to invite you, and we certainly will in the future. And I hope you'll continue to say yes as graciously as you always have. It's wonderful to hear your analysis. It was also great, obviously, to be joined by Congressman Jerry Connolly and to hear his insights and analysis as well at this really pivotal moment. So with that, I thank all of you, our audience, for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you next time on JStream. Thanks so much.
Thanks for hosting me.